A little boy, all alone at the palace gates, waits day after day. But why? When a royal guard finally approaches him, what he discovers will shock you. This heartbreaking moment will change everything. Don't miss the powerful reason behind the boy's endless wait. Stay with us until the end to witness a story of love, loss, and hope like you've never seen before. Before we dive into this moving story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will stay with you long after they're told. Sergeant William Anderson stood at attention, his polished boots clicking sharply against the cold cobblestones of the palace grounds. The towering walls of the royal estate loomed above him, each stone a testament to centuries of history, power, and tradition. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and a sense of formality that seemed to cling to the very air around him. Every movement, every step was dictated by precision, something he had learned to embrace since his first day as a royal guard. For 5 years, William had patrolled the palace grounds with unwavering dedication. His daily routine had become as ingrained in him as breathing, an endless cycle of disciplined patrols, sharp salutes, and meticulous checks of every gate and every hallway. It was a life of duty above all else, where personal thoughts, emotions, and connections were secondary to the role he played in protecting the royal family. He was, after all, a soldier of the crown, and his oath demanded nothing less than complete allegiance. The palace grounds, though vast and grand, were also hauntingly silent at this hour. The last of the tourists had departed, leaving behind only the quiet hum of palace security systems and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. William's footsteps echoed in the solitude, his breath forming small clouds in the cool evening air. As he made his way down the long, secluded path near the back gate, his mind began to wander. It was, after all, a routine shift, one that he had done hundreds of times before, each time with the same sense of duty and detachment. His eyes scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The palace gates were securely locked, the perimeter was intact, and all seemed well. Yet, as he turned a corner near the castle's lower entrance, something caught his eye. A small figure, barely discernible in the growing darkness, sat huddled against the ancient stone wall. At first glance, it appeared to be just another homeless person seeking shelter. It was a common enough sight near the palace walls, as the city's homeless often found their way here, drawn by the relative safety and protection the palace grounds offered. But as he drew closer, William's senses tingled with an unfamiliar unease. The shape wasn't a grown adult, as he'd assumed. It was a child, a boy, no older than 10 or 12. His small form was curled tightly in on itself, shivering against the evening chill. His clothes were ragged, a patchwork of tattered fabric barely held together. His dark skin blended with the shadows, but William could make out the faint glint of his eyes, wide and unblinking, even in the fading light. For a moment, William stopped in his tracks, his instinct kicking in. A child. Here, of all places. The boy's presence was so out of place in the midst of the meticulously maintained palace grounds that it took William a moment to fully process the sight. The palace was a world apart from the struggles of the street. There was no place for a child like this to simply be. His presence didn't belong here. Yet there the boy was. Silent, unmoving, and alone. William's thoughts flickered to his training. Strict protocols demanded that any unknown person, especially a child, be reported immediately. Security was paramount, and any deviation from the plan could result in severe consequences. But as he stared at the boy, something in his chest tightened. This child was no threat. In fact, there was something profoundly vulnerable about him, something that cut through the soldier's heart and enchanted him. William hesitated, his duty and compassion pulling in opposite directions. He knew the right thing to do was to report this immediately. The child, alone and abandoned, was likely in need of help. But as he stood there, watching the boy's fragile form, A quiet voice in his head urged him to pause, to understand what was truly happening. His instincts told him to be cautious, but his heart was already beginning to break for the child sitting there, as if he had nowhere else to go. The boy was silent, his eyes never once leaving the palace gates, as though waiting for something, or someone. And in that moment, William knew he would have to find out why. He couldn't ignore this. He couldn't simply walk away. With a sigh, he squared his shoulders and took a slow step forward, his boots making no sound on the stone path. He approached the boy cautiously, trying to be as gentle as possible. His heart was already heavy with the weight of the decision he was about to make. "Hey, kid," William said softly, his voice breaking the silence of the night. "What are you doing here?" The boy didn't react at first. His small body remained hunched, his eyes locked on the distant gates. William crouched down beside him, his uniform a sharp contrast to the boy's tattered appearance. "You shouldn't be here," William continued, trying to keep his tone neutral, though concern seeped into his words. "Are you lost?" For a long moment there was no answer. The boy remained still, his gaze never wavering from the gates, as though lost in some faraway thought. William hesitated, wondering if the boy even understood him. But then, just as he was about to speak again, the boy shifted, slowly turning his head to meet William's gaze. His eyes were wide, filled with an unspoken depth of emotion. There was a quiet sorrow there, a sadness that felt far beyond his years. "I'm waiting for her," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the night. William blinked, unsure of what the boy meant. Waiting for who? The boy's lips quivered slightly as he spoke again, this time more firmly. "My mother, she told me she would come back. She said she'd be here, at the palace, waiting for me." William's breath caught in his throat. The boy's words, so innocent, so filled with an unshakable belief, made something inside William snap. The boy was waiting for someone who might never return. The palace, once a symbol of grandeur and power, was now a cruel backdrop to this child's quiet hope. For the first time in years, William felt the weight of his own humanity pressing against the rigid walls of protocol and duty. The boy had no place here, and yet here he was, his faith unwavering despite the hopelessness that surrounded him. The palace gates, meant to keep the world out, had trapped this child in a nightmare of abandonment. "Are you here, kid?" William asked again, his voice thick with emotion now. "Why are you waiting?" The boy's eyes dropped to the ground, his small hands clutching the tattered blanket wrapped around him. "She said she'd be back. She promised me." His voice cracked, and William felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. A small, defenseless child, alone at the gates of a palace, holding on to a promise that had long since been broken. And in that moment, William knew he couldn't just leave. He couldn't walk away from the boy and his broken dream. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He would not abandon him, not when the child's whole world had already been torn apart. The next few days followed a similar rhythm. Sergeant William Anderson's routine patrols around the palace grounds were uneventful, but his mind often drifted to the boy. The sight of him, sitting alone at the palace entrance, his small body curled up on a tattered blanket, haunted William's thoughts, like an echo in a silent room. Every evening, without fail, the boy returned to the same spot, against the cold stone walls of the palace, as if tethered to the place by some invisible force. William couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard he tried. At first he chalked it up to the routine of the city, the transient nature of the homeless, the way they often found their way to the palace gates in search of shelter or warmth. He thought maybe the boy was just another one of the many lost souls who passed through the gates, unnoticed by the bustling crowds and cold, regimented life of the palace. But the boy was different. There was a stillness in him that William couldn't ignore, a quietness that seemed almost deliberate. He never called out for help, never asked for anything. He simply sat there, eyes fixed on the gates, as if waiting for something or someone. William had seen him each day, in the same position, in the same quiet vigil. It was unsettling. The god's curiosity grew. It wasn't just the boy's strange persistence that piqued his interest. It was the sorrow in his eyes, the quiet resignation that clung to him like a shadow. The boy had no voice, no requests for food or shelter. He only sat there, watching the gates, day in and day out. William had tried to keep his distance, as protocol dictated. Guards were not supposed to engage with civilians beyond what was necessary for security. But something about the boy, sitting there like a fixture against the cold stone, gnawed at William's conscience. He found himself looking for the boy every time he passed by, though he tried to keep his focus on his duties. It was impossible, though. The boy's presence was like a magnet, drawing his gaze every time. Over the next few days, William couldn't help but notice small things, details that spoke volumes. The boy never made a sound. He never asked for help, never begged for food. He simply sat, wrapped in a worn, thin blanket, staring at the gates as if they held the key to everything he needed. But then, there were moments when the boy's eyes would briefly flicker up from his spot, glancing at the gates with an intensity that made William's chest tighten. There was longing in those eyes, something deeper than hunger or weariness. It was as though the boy saw something beyond the walls of the palace, something he desperately hoped for and maybe, just maybe, expected to find. Every time William passed by, he found himself looking for that moment, the brief second when the boy's gaze met the gates, filled with such quiet determination that it seemed as though the child was waiting for something that could never come. That silent hope, that belief in something impossible, struck a chord deep within William's heart. It made him uneasy, the way the boy seemed so anchored to a place that, on the surface, had nothing to offer him. As days passed, William couldn't help but wonder, what was he waiting for? Who was this child, and why did he come back to the same spot, day after day, without fail? William began to pay closer attention during his patrols, trying to find any sign of the boy's background, anything that might explain his presence. He walked by the boy each time with a practiced indifference, keeping his distance but never fully able to ignore him. He started to notice other small things about the boy, how he always wore the same clothes, frayed and stained, how his hair was tangled and unkempt, as though no one had taken care of him for some time. Each night, William would pass by, his eyes fleetingly catching the boy's presence. The boy's unblinking stare would follow him for a brief moment before he returned to his vigil. There was no sense of fear in the boy's eyes, no cry for help, only that same quiet resolve. William wrestled with his emotions. He was supposed to keep his distance, follow orders, and report any unauthorized presence. But this boy wasn't like the others he had seen. He wasn't just a face in the crowd. There was something else in his eyes, a story that William couldn't fully grasp, but felt he had to uncover. What was the boy's connection to the palace? What was he waiting for at the gates of a place that was meant to shut out the world? There was more to this child than met the eye, and William could feel it. But protocol was clear: no engagement. He had to report the boy, not interact with him. He had to follow the rules. His duty as a royal guard meant that any unknown person on the grounds was a potential security threat. But every time he saw the boy, he found himself hesitating, unable to act as if he had seen nothing. His conscience weighed on him, and each day, the urge to help the boy grew stronger. One evening, as William made his usual rounds, he found himself unable to keep walking past the boy. His steps slowed as he approached the spot where the boy sat, still and silent, his back pressed against the cold stone of the wall. For a moment, William hesitated, his mind a battlefield between duty and compassion. He had been trained to respond to threats, to follow orders, but this child was not a threat. William stopped a few feet away from the boy, watching him for a moment before speaking softly, almost to himself. "Why are you here?" he asked, though he knew the boy couldn't answer, not with words. Still, he couldn't help but wonder. What had brought him to this place? What did he expect from the palace, from the royal gates that never opened to him? The boy's gaze remained fixed on the palace gates, unblinking, unwavering. And then, as though hearing William's voice for the first time, the boy slowly turned his head. His eyes met William's, and for a brief moment, William saw the depth of the boy's quiet despair. The boy didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke volumes. There was something urgent, something desperate in those eyes, a need for something that William couldn't yet comprehend. The silence between them stretched long, filled with unspoken words and emotions. And as William stood there, watching the boy, his internal struggle deepened. He had followed protocol every day, hadn't questioned it, hadn't looked beyond the orders that governed his life. But now, in this moment, everything seemed different. What if the boy wasn't just waiting for something? What if he was waiting for something more? As the evening deepened and the shadows grew longer, William made a decision. He could no longer ignore the boy. He had to know the truth, who the boy was, why he was here, and what had brought him to this place. The boy's silent vigil had become more than just an oddity in William's patrol. It had become a question he needed to answer. It was the fourth day that William found himself standing in front of the boy once again. The same spot near the palace gates, the same worn blanket, the same quiet presence. The boy was there as always, silent, unmoving, staring at the towering gates with a look of such longing that it almost seemed as though he was waiting for the gates themselves to open. William had kept his distance, his gaze sweeping the grounds, his mind clouded with doubt. But today, as the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows over the palace, something inside him snapped. The urgency that had been building within him over the past few days now threatened to overwhelm him. He could no longer ignore the quiet desperation of the child. The boy was not just another homeless face, not just a passerby seeking shelter. He was something more. Something that William couldn't yet understand but needed to. He had to know why the boy was here, what had brought him to this place. As the last few tourists dispersed and the evening silence settled over the palace, William's mind was made up. He finished his rounds, his steps measured but heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. The palace was eerily quiet now, the usual hum of activity replaced by the rustle of wind in the trees. As he neared the boy's spot, William felt a strange tightness in his chest. He could no longer pretend that this was just another part of his patrol. When he arrived at the gate where the boy sat, William hesitated for a moment, watching him from a distance. The boy's body was still curled against the cold stone wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. His eyes were vacant, staring ahead, yet lost in a world that no one else could see. William approached slowly, trying to make his presence known without startling the child. He crouched down beside him, his boots silent on the stone floor. He reached out, gently tapping the boy's shoulder, his voice soft. "Hey, kid." The boy flinched, his body stiffening for a second, but then he relaxed. He didn't move to sit up or acknowledge William directly. Instead, his gaze remained locked on the gates ahead. "I need to talk to you," William said, his tone calm but filled with concern. "Why are you here? Why do you sit here every day?" There was a long pause before the boy spoke, his voice a low whisper as if he had not used it in a long time. "I'm waiting for her," the boy replied, his eyes still fixed on the gates, never meeting William's gaze. "She said she'd come back for me." William's heart tightened, and his stomach turned in knots. The boy's words were so simple, yet they carried the weight of something deeper, something far more tragic. "Who?" William asked gently. "Who are you waiting for?" "My mom," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "She used to work here, at the palace. She said she'd come back for me. She promised she would. A heavy silence fell between them. William's mind raced as the boy's words sank in. He had been waiting for someone who hadn't come back, for someone who had promised to return but never did. The boy's small body, curled in a tight ball, seemed to reflect the weight of that promise. Broken and abandoned, yet somehow still clinging to the hope that the palace held the key to reuniting them. "How long have you been waiting here?" William asked, his voice softer now, filled with a deep sense of empathy. The boy finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking with William's for the first time. The sorrow in them was palpable, deep and haunting. "Since she left," the boy said, his words simple, yet they carried the heaviness of years. "She told me to wait here. She said the palace would keep me safe, that she would come back. She promised she would." The guard swallowed hard, his heart heavy with the weight of the child's words. William had heard stories of children abandoned by parents, of families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, but this was different. This was real. This boy was living in a limbo of hope, waiting for someone who might never return. The thought made something inside William twist painfully. The child's loyalty to his mother, the child's undying hope that one day she would walk through those gates and take him home. It was heartbreaking. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the boy's shoulder before he gently placed it there, his touch offering the only comfort he could give in that moment. "Where is she now?" William asked, struggling to keep his voice steady, fighting against the lump forming in his throat. "Has anyone tried to help you find her?" The boy's eyes filled with silent tears, but he did not speak. Instead, he slowly shook his head. The pain was in his eyes, quiet and deep. He didn't need to say any more. William felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. In the span of a few moments, everything he had known about duty and protocol had come crashing down around him. The boy wasn't just an orphaned child or a stray passerby. He was a symbol of something far more insidious: the forgotten, the lost, the abandoned, left to fend for themselves while the royal walls stood firm, impenetrable, and cold. And yet the boy was here, in front of him, clinging to a false hope that the palace held the key to his mother's return. William could feel the deep sadness rising within him, an empathy so raw it threatened to overwhelm him. This was no longer just about following the rules. This wasn't about duty anymore. This was about a child, lost and alone, clinging to a dream that was slipping away with every passing day. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "She said she'd come back for me. She promised she would." William's heart broke for him. He realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that the boy had been abandoned in the worst way possible, not just by his mother, but by the system, by society, by the very institution William had pledged to serve. This child had been left to wait, to hope, to believe in something that would never come, and William, the one person who could do something about it, had done nothing, until now. As the silence stretched between them, William's thoughts became a tangled mess of guilt, sorrow, and disbelief. He knew the right thing to do. The boy needed help, he needed care, he needed someone to make sure he was safe. But how could he help when everything about the palace, the very institution that had kept this child at its gates, told him to do nothing? The weight of his duty as a royal guard seemed almost irrelevant now. What was duty when a child was suffering? What was loyalty to an institution that allowed something like this to happen? "I'll help you," William said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out again, this time putting a hand on the boy's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "I don't know what happened to your mother, but I'll help you. You don't have to wait here anymore, I promise." The boy turned his head, looking up at William with wide, tear-filled eyes. There was a flicker of hope in his gaze, a fragile, tentative hope that William had never seen in a child before. It was as if he couldn't believe the words, as though hearing them meant daring to hope again. "Thank you," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. William nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how he would help this boy, or where to start. But he knew one thing for certain. The boy didn't deserve to be forgotten. He deserved more than to be left at the gates of a palace, hoping for a mother who wasn't coming back. And so, in that moment, William made a vow to this child, a vow to do whatever it took to help him find the safety and care he so desperately needed. He would not allow this boy's silent hope to wither away. William sat in silence beside the boy, the world around them fading into the background. The sky above them darkened as the evening deepened, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the cool night air. The boy, still wrapped in his tattered blanket, remained close, his small body shaking slightly from the cold. His eyes were no longer fixed on the gates. Now they were on William, as though searching for something. Perhaps understanding, perhaps reassurance that he so desperately needed. The child's quiet words echoed in William's mind, replaying over and over again. She promised she would come back for me. She said the palace would keep me safe. There was no mistaking it. The boy's hope, fragile and unwavering, was based on the most human of emotions, love. A love that had been abandoned, forgotten, and left to rot at the gates of a palace that seemed indifferent to his pain. It wasn't the palace that would save him. It was the boy's belief in something better, something more. As the boy spoke of his mother, of the promises she made, William's heart sank deeper with each word. The weight of the child's pain was palpable, and with each piece of the boy's story that unfolded, William could feel his own walls cracking. The boy wasn't just waiting for his mother, he was waiting for a world that had promised to protect him, a world that had failed him long ago. William felt his chest tighten as the boy continued to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. He told William how his mother had once been proud to work at the palace, telling him stories of the royal family and the grandeur of the halls where she worked. She had told him that one day they would have a better life, that she would bring him into this world of power and security, a world that seemed so far removed from the harsh reality they lived in. But that day never came. The boy's mother had disappeared one day, leaving nothing but a promise that William now knew had been broken long ago. In the space between the boy's words, William felt the weight of his own life, his own buried pain, rising to the surface. He had always believed that his duty was to protect, to serve the crown, and to follow the rigid protocols of his role as a royal guard. But now, hearing the boy's story, hearing the raw vulnerability in his voice, William felt the foundations of his belief system begin to tremble. The boy's mother had promised she would return, but she didn't. She left him, and now the boy was left to fend for himself, with only the cold, imposing gates of the palace as his companion. And here William sat, hearing the words that mirrored his own deepest fears. Promises broken, hopes dashed, and a life left in the hands of those who had long since abandoned their responsibility. The boy's words triggered something deep inside William, something he had buried long ago, something he had never fully acknowledged. It was a memory, a moment in his own past when he had lost someone he loved. He remembered the day his sister had left, promising to come back for him, promising that they would be together again. But she never did. She had been taken from him, and the empty promises that followed her departure had haunted him for years. He had never spoken of it, not to anyone, not even to the men he served beside. It was easier to lock away that part of himself, to bury the pain under the cold professionalism of his guard's uniform. He had focused on duty, on loyalty, on the service to the royal family, anything to avoid confronting the gaping wound that had festered in his heart for years. But now, sitting beside this child, hearing him speak of the same kind of abandonment, the same unfulfilled promises, William could no longer ignore the parallels. He felt the weight of the years of unresolved grief pressing down on him, The pain he had locked away for so long was suddenly surfacing, raw and unfiltered. The boy's quiet voice, his simple words about his mother, triggered something inside William that he had never allowed himself to feel. He had tried to be strong, to remain detached from the world he served. But now, in the face of this child's suffering, he realized just how hollow that detachment had become. He had hidden his own grief under the guise of duty, but in the presence of the boy's raw, unguarded heart, William could no longer keep the wall up. A strangled sound escaped his throat, a sob, half-choked, before he could suppress it. His eyes stung with the force of the emotion rising within him, the tears threatening to spill as he turned his gaze away from the boy, unable to bear the weight of his own grief. The boy, sensing something shift in the guard, looked up at him quietly. William's chest heaved with the sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion that washed over him. His hands trembled, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. The tears that had threatened to fall now escaped in a torrent, his composure shattered. He had spent so long living behind the walls of duty, so long burying his own pain beneath the cold discipline of a soldier, that he had forgotten what it was like to truly feel the weight of someone else's sorrow. Now, as he looked at the boy, whose small, broken heart mirrored his own pain, he couldn't hold back the tears any longer. "I'm so sorry," William whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking. The words felt inadequate, insufficient, but they were all he could offer in that moment. "I'm so sorry." The boy, watching him closely, didn't speak at first. His small face was a mixture of confusion and something else. Understanding, perhaps. He sensed that something was different now. That the guard who had stood so tall, so resolute, had now bent beneath the weight of their shared grief. And then, in a moment that would forever change both of their lives, the boy reached out, placing a small, trembling hand on William's arm. It was a tentative touch, but it was enough. Enough to break through the walls William had built around himself. Enough to bridge the gap between them, between a man who had spent years serving a system that had failed him, and a boy who had been abandoned by that same system. "You're not alone either," the boy whispered, his voice so soft, so small, but somehow carrying the weight of a lifetime of hurt. "I know you're not." The words hit William like a physical blow. He blinked rapidly, trying to push the tears back, but they kept coming one after another, as if the floodgates had been thrown wide open. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel, to truly feel. And in that shared moment of grief, they found something deeper than sorrow. They found a connection, a bond between two souls, both broken in their own ways, but both yearning for something more. William sat there, the boy's hand still resting on his arm, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. The pain was still there, still raw and unhealed, but now, for just a moment, it felt like the weight was a little lighter. As the night stretched on, the two of them sat together in silence, the boy still waiting for a mother who might never come back, and William waiting for a world that might never change. But, for now, they were not alone. They shared a moment of understanding that transcended words. The boy, sensing the shift, whispered once more, "Thank you." William didn't have the words to reply. He only nodded, wiping the last of his tears away as he reached out to comfort the boy in return, knowing that whatever came next, he would not walk this road alone. William couldn't shake the weight of the boy's words, the silent connection they had forged in the darkness of the palace gates. He sat there, still and heavy with emotion, as the evening deepened around them. His mind raced. Everything he had ever believed about duty, about service, about his place in the royal guard felt so small now, so insignificant in the face of this child's raw need for help. The walls that had protected him, that had kept him emotionally distant for years, had crumbled in an instant. He couldn't go back to the man he was before, the man who would have continued to follow orders without question. He couldn't ignore the boy any longer. As the last traces of sunlight faded from the sky, William stood up slowly, looking down at the boy, who now seemed both fragile and stronger than anyone he had ever known. His heart was filled with something he couldn't quite name. Determination, perhaps? Or maybe it was just the overwhelming sense that this child, so innocent and abandoned, was depending on him. Without a word, William extended a hand to the boy, who looked up at him in surprise. There was still a flicker of uncertainty in the boy's eyes, but there was also a quiet trust, one that had grown over the course of the past few minutes. "I'm not going to leave you here," William said, his voice firm. "You don't have to wait any more. I'll help you find your mother, or at least I'll make sure you're safe." The boy's eyes widened, and for a moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, cautiously, he reached out and took William's hand. The touch was small, delicate, but it was enough. William's heart swelled in that moment, a feeling of deep responsibility settling over him. This was it. The moment he had been avoiding, the moment where he would step away from his duty as a royal guard and into something far more important. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The boy, who had once been a fixture of the palace gates, now looked to him for guidance, for protection. William couldn't ignore the reality anymore. He couldn't let this child down. "I'll help you," William repeated, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together." The decision weighed heavily on William. As he walked with the boy back through the palace grounds, his thoughts turned to the consequences of his actions. He had broken protocol, grave protocol. The palace had strict rules about how to handle unauthorized individuals on the grounds. He had violated those rules by approaching the boy, by speaking with him, by making promises he might not be able to keep. And now, with his decision to step away from his post, to put the boy first, he knew that there would be no easy way out of the mess he was about to create. His mind flashed to Major Pembroke, to the cold, calculating officer who lived by the book and would never condone such an act of insubordination. William could already feel the weight of that eventual confrontation, the disciplinary action, the possible reassignment, maybe even the loss of his position altogether. He had known the consequences from the start, but in this moment they felt trivial in comparison to what was unfolding before him. The boy, abandoned and broken, deserved more than the indifference of bureaucracy. As they walked through the quiet, empty halls of the palace, William found himself questioning everything he had stood for. His duty to the crown had always come first, but now he couldn't help but feel that the crown was not the one that needed his service anymore. This child needed him. This child needed someone to believe in him, to take him in when the world had cast him aside. William could no longer ignore the deep-seated guilt that had been gnawing at him since the moment he first saw the boy sitting alone at the gates. This was his chance to do something right, something that would redeem him from the unfeeling, cold routine of his life as a soldier. The boy's future, fragile and uncertain, lay in his hands now. When they reached a quiet corner of the palace grounds, away from the watchful eyes of the other guards, William crouched down to the boy's level. He placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt strange and new, but somehow natural. "You're not alone," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have me now." The boy looked up at him with wide eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, any sign that this might be another empty promise. William met his gaze, the truth of his words hanging between them like a bond, unspoken but undeniable. "I'll stay with you. I'll make sure you're safe," William continued. "No more waiting." The boy nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. He was still afraid, still unsure, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes now. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to trust again. As the days passed, William kept his promise. He arranged for the boy to stay in a small hidden corner of the castle, where no one could see them. He brought food, blankets, anything the boy needed. He checked in on him as often as possible, but even more than that, William spent time with the boy, talking to him, listening to him, and learning about his life before the palace. The boy, whose name was Eli, began to open up in small ways, sharing bits and pieces of his life before his mother's disappearance. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Eli spoke of the few happy memories he had, his mother singing to him at night, the way her eyes lit up when she told him stories of the royal family. He remembered the promise she had made to him, a promise that had kept him going even after she had disappeared. But as much as Eli wanted to believe his mother would return, there was an emptiness in him now. The hope that had once burned brightly was now flickering, fading with each passing day. He was only a child, but the reality of his situation was clear to him. He couldn't keep waiting. William, ever watchful, saw the change in Eli. It was subtle at first, a little more playfulness, a little more laughter. But eventually it became clear that the boy was no longer the same fragile, broken child who had sat at the gates. He was healing, little by little, with William's presence offering him a new kind of stability. One night, after a long day spent in the shadows of the palace, William sat with Eli outside, watching the moon rise over the ancient walls. The air was cool and the night was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. Eli was leaning against him, his small head resting on William's shoulder as they both stared up at the sky. "You're not alone anymore," William said quietly, his words simple but filled with conviction. "You have a family now. You have me." Eli looked up at him, his eyes wide, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. It was small, tentative, but it was a smile that spoke volumes. He hadn't smiled like that in a long time. "I know," Eli whispered, his voice filled with a newfound sense of peace. In that moment, William realized that he had found something more important than duty. He had found a purpose. Eli wasn't just another child in need of help. He was someone William had come to care for deeply, someone he would protect with everything he had. And in return, Eli had shown him that there was more to life than following orders, more to life than the walls of the palace. Together they would face whatever came next, and no matter what, they would never be alone again. The days that followed were quieter, filled with a sense of purpose William had never felt before. His usual patrols now felt like a distant memory, a life that no longer aligned with who he had become. Instead of the cold walls of the palace or the rigid routines of his military life, he found himself focusing on something far more human, something that touched him in ways he had never anticipated. As he walked through the familiar corridors of the palace, now in a new light, William couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The duty he had once sworn to follow without question now seemed more like a series of hollow commands, rules that ignored the most basic human needs. He thought back to his first encounter with Eli, how he had been nothing more than an anonymous face against the backdrop of royal duties. But that child's quiet pain had pierced through the walls of his own detachment, revealing the stark reality of a system that left people like Eli to suffer in silence. For years, William had believed that his service to the crown, to the institution, was the highest form of duty. But now, as he reflected on his actions, he knew the truth. True service wasn't about following orders, about standing guard at the gates of the palace. It was about standing up for those who had no voice, no power. It was about using his position to offer protection, compassion, and justice where it was needed most. His decision to act against protocol, to break the very rules he had sworn to uphold, had changed him. It had torn down the walls that had kept him detached and distant from the world, and in doing so, it had made him more whole, more human. William had always lived by the belief that the job of a guard was to protect, But now he realized that true protection went beyond the physical. It meant offering care, providing comfort, and above all, showing empathy. It was the way he held Eli's hand when the boy had no one else to turn to, the way he reassured him that the gates of the palace were no longer a symbol of abandonment, but a doorway to something better. The future, once uncertain for Eli, now seemed filled with possibility. As he sat on a bench outside the palace one evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grounds, William looked over at Eli, who was standing near the gates, his small face turned toward the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eli was smiling, his eyes sparkling with a glimmer of hope that William had never seen before. "Hey!" William called, his voice gentle. Eli turned, his face lighting up when he saw William. He walked over, his small steps quick and light, like the burden of uncertainty had been lifted from his shoulders. "You okay?" William asked, his tone full of warmth. Eli nodded, his smile growing even wider. "Yeah, I'm okay now." For a moment they both stood there, side by side, watching the world go by. The palace gates, which had once symbolized separation, isolation, and despair, now represented a new life for Eli, a life where he was no longer waiting, no longer abandoned. "You know," William began, his voice thoughtful, "when I first saw you sitting here, I didn't understand. I didn't get why you were waiting, but now I do. You were waiting for something, someone who might never come back." He paused, his gaze softening. "But that doesn't mean you have to keep waiting. You have me now. You have a future." Eli looked up at him, his eyes searching, as if he was trying to find the truth in William's words. The boy's once broken spirit now had a flicker of life, a possibility that had been absent before. He had been waiting for a mother who never returned, for promises that had been broken, but now, with William beside him, Eli was beginning to understand that he didn't need to wait anymore. The future was his to shape. "I know," Eli said softly, his voice steady. "I don't have to wait anymore. I can move forward." William smiled, a feeling of peace settling over him. The boy's words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through together. They had both found something in each other, something that would carry them through whatever came next. As the evening wore on, William realized that his life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. He had set aside the rigid protocols and detached professionalism that had governed his life for so long, and in doing so, he had found a new way to serve. Not through blind duty, but through human connection and empathy. He had given Eli a chance at a new life, and in return, Eli had given him the chance to rediscover what it meant to truly protect, to truly care. The palace gates, which had once been a symbol of royal power and indifference, now felt like a doorway to something different. No longer a place of abandonment, they were now the threshold of a new beginning for Ellie. The future, once uncertain and filled with pain, was now full of possibilities, of growth, and of hope. William looked at the boy beside him, who was no longer just a child lost in the shadows of the palace walls, but someone with a future, someone who was not alone anymore. He had a family now, not by blood, but by choice, a family built on trust, understanding, and compassion. And as William stood up, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead, he knew that whatever the future held, he was no longer bound by the rules of the past. His duty, his service, was now defined by something far more powerful, the bond he had formed with Eli and the shared belief that no one should ever have to face the world alone.